When Admiral Morrison grabbed Staff Sergeant Maria's rifle without permission, he made a deadly mistake. She wasn't just any soldier. She was the best sniper in Afghanistan. 7 impossible shots later, he learned why you never touch another warrior's weapon. Some lessons cost more than pride. Before you watch full story, comment below from which country are you watching. Don't forget to subscribe. The scorching Afghan sun beat down mercilessly on forward, operating base shield wall, turning the dust into a fine powder that coated everything in sight. Staff Sergeant Maria Ghost Castellanos knelt beside her Barrett M82A1, methodically cleaning each component with the precision of a surgeon. The .50 caliber rifle was more than just a weapon to her. It was an extension of her soul, calibrated perfectly to her breathing, her heartbeat, her very essence as a marksman. At 26, Maria had already earned a reputation that preceded her into every briefing room and every fire base from Helmand to Kandahar. 3 tours, 67 confirmed kills, and a silver star for the day she held off an entire Taliban squad for 8 hours while her unit evacuated wounded Marines. The rifle before her had been her companion through all of it. Its stock worn smooth by countless hours in hide sites, its scope zeroed to perfection through trial by fire. The base hummed with pre-mission tension. Operation Nightfall was set to commence at 400, a surgical strike to eliminate a high-value target that intelligence had been tracking for months. Maria's role was critical. Provide overwatch from a ridge 200 meters out, eliminate sentries, and ensure the assault team could breach the compound without casualties. She was alone in the armory tent when the shadow fell across her workspace. Looking up, she found herself staring at 3 gold stars on a crisp desert camouflage uniform. Admiral Robert Iron Morrison stood in the entrance, his weathered face set in the permanent scowl that had intimidated junior officers for 3 decades. Behind him, a small entourage of staff officers shuffled nervously, clearly uncomfortable with whatever was about to unfold. Staff Sergeant Castellanos. Morrison's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to absolute obedience. I need to inspect that weapon. Maria rose slowly, keeping her expression neutral despite the warning bells going off in her head. Morrison had arrived at the FOB 2 days earlier, on what was supposed to be a routine inspection tour. Word had spread quickly through the ranks that the Admiral wasn't happy about women in combat roles, particularly in specialized positions like designated marksman. Sir, with respect, the weapon is mission-ready and properly maintained according to... I didn't ask for a status report. Sergeant. Morrison stepped closer, his eyes fixed on the Barrett. I've been reviewing your file. Impressive numbers, I'll give you that. But numbers on paper don't tell the whole story, do they? The tent fell silent except for the distant sound of helicopters and the ever-present hum of generators. Maria felt the familiar calm settling over her, the same stillness that came before a difficult shot. She recognized the setup. She'd seen it before with other commanding officers who couldn't reconcile their preconceptions with her track record. Sir, my record speaks for itself. 67 confirmed eliminations, 0 friendly fire incidents, and pretty impressive resume for someone who probably got fast-tracked through sniper school. Morrison's tone carried just enough condescension to make his intent clear. Tell me, Sergeant, when's the last time you actually field-stripped and reassembled that rifle under pressure? One of the staff officers, a young captain named Davies, shifted uncomfortably. Admiral, Staff Sergeant Castellanos holds the base record for weapon maintenance drills. She's also the primary instructor for... Morrison silenced him with a glare. Captain, I don't recall asking for your input. He turned back to Maria, extending his hand toward the Barrett. I want to see for myself if this weapon is truly mission-ready, or if we're putting lives at risk on the assumption that gender equality trumps operational effectiveness. The words hung in the air like smoke from a mortar blast. Maria felt something cold and dangerous settle in her chest. Not anger, but the absolute clarity that came with understanding exactly what was happening. This wasn't about weapon maintenance or mission readiness. This was about proving a point, about putting her in her place in front of witnesses. Sir, she said, her voice carrying a deadly quiet that made the staff officers take an involuntary step back. That rifle is zeroed specifically to my shooting position, my eye relief, and my breathing pattern. Any adjustment to its configuration could compromise mission effectiveness. Morrison's smile was sharp as a blade. I think I can handle inspecting a rifle without breaking it, Sergeant. I was shooting before you were born. He reached for the Barrett's barrel, his intention clear. That's when Maria made a decision that would change everything. "Sir, I cannot allow you to handle my primary weapon system without proper authorization from the mission commander." The tent went dead silent. Morrison's hand froze inches from the rifle, his face darkening with a rage that had been building since he'd first read her personnel file. Behind him, the staff officers looked like they wanted to disappear into the canvas walls. "Did you just refuse a direct order, Staff Sergeant?" "No, sir. I'm following standing operating procedures regarding weapon security during pre-mission preparation. According to Regulation 19011, primary weapon systems cannot be compromised within 12 hours of mission commencement without written authorization from—" Morrison's hand shot out, grabbing the Barrett's stock. "Enough of your regulation quoting. Hand over the weapon. Now." What happened next unfolded in slow motion like the moment between squeezing a trigger and impact. Maria's combatives training took over. 3 years of intensive hand-to-hand combat instruction that had been drilled into muscle memory. As Morrison pulled on the rifle, she used his momentum against him, executing a perfect arm drag that sent him stumbling forward while maintaining control of the Barrett. The Admiral caught himself before falling, but the damage was done. Every person in that tent had just witnessed a staff sergeant physically resist a 3-star admiral. The implications hit everyone simultaneously. Courts-martial, career destruction, the end of everything Maria had worked for. But Morrison surprised everyone. Instead of erupting in rage, he straightened his uniform and fixed Maria with a calculating stare. When he spoke, his voice was deadly calm. "Very well, Sergeant. You want to protect your precious rifle? Prove it deserves that protection." He gestured toward the tent flap. "Range time. Right now, 7 targets, distances from 400 to 500 meters. If you miss even 1 shot, you're out of the military with a dishonorable discharge. If you make all 7, he paused, his smile predatory. "We'll discuss your future." Word spread through the base faster than wildfire in dry grass. By the time they reached the long-range firing complex, nearly 100 Marines, soldiers, and support personnel had found reasons to be in the area. The range stretched out into the Afghan wilderness, marked by steel targets at precisely measured distances. The wind flags hung limp in the late afternoon heat, but Maria could feel the subtle air currents that would affect bullet trajectory at longer ranges. Morrison had chosen the targets personally, 7 steel plates, each roughly the size of a man's torso, positioned at 400, 600, 800, 1,000, 1,200, 400, and 500 meters. The final 3 shots would push the Barrett to its effective limits, especially in the high altitude and thin air of the Afghan mountains. "Single shot each target," Morrison announced to the gathered crowd. "No second chances, no do-overs. Miss one, pack your bags." He checked his watch. "You have 5 minutes to prepare." Maria knelt behind the Barrett, which she'd positioned on its bipod at the edge of the firing line. Around her, the crowd maintained respectful silence, understanding they were witnessing something that would become legend regardless of the outcome. She could feel their eyes on her, the weight of their expectations and doubts. But as she settled into position, all of that faded away. The crowd, the Admiral, the career-ending stakes. Everything disappeared except the familiar comfort of the rifle against her shoulder and the distant targets wavering in the heat haze. She thought of her grandfather, Roberto Castellanos, who had taught her to shoot with an old .22 rifle on his ranch in New Mexico. "Mija," he used to say, "the rifle knows when your heart is true. Trust it, and it will never fail you." She thought of her first combat kill in Iraq, a sniper who had been terrorizing a Marine outpost for weeks, the 800-meter shot that ended his reign of terror and saved countless American lives. She thought of the ambush in Helmand Province where she'd held an impossible position for 8 hours, her Barrett speaking death to anyone foolish enough to show themselves in her kill zone. But mostly, she thought about the Marines who would be counting on her tomorrow morning, whose lives depended on her ability to clear the way for their assault. This wasn't about pride or proving a point anymore. This was about the mission and the sacred trust between a marksman and the troops she was sworn to protect. "Time," Morrison called out. Maria had spent the 5 minutes reading the wind, checking her scope's 0 and centering herself. She hadn't touched the rifle's settings. They were perfect, calibrated through hundreds of missions and thousands of rounds. The Barrett was ready. The question was whether the Admiral was ready for what came next. Target 1, 400 meters, Morrison announced. The first target was almost insultingly easy for someone of Maria's caliber. She acquired it through her scope, noted the slight crosswind from the east, and settled into her natural breathing pattern. The trigger broke cleanly, and the .50 caliber round crossed the distance in less than half a second. The steel plate rang like a bell, the sound echoing across the range. "Hit," called the spotter, though everyone had heard the impact. Target 2, 600 meters. Another straightforward shot well within the Barrett's comfort zone. Maria's breathing remained steady, her heart rate actually slowing as she settled deeper into the familiar rhythm of precision shooting. The second target fell to her bullet with mechanical certainty. Hit. Target 3, 800 meters. Now they were entering the range where wind and atmospheric conditions began to matter. Maria read the subtle signs, the barely perceptible movement of dust in the distance, the heat shimmer rising from the rocks, the feel of air pressure against her skin. She adjusted her point of aim by mere inches and sent the third round downrange. Another clean hit. The crowd was completely silent now, understanding they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even Morrison's staff officers watched with professional appreciation as Maria worked through the targets with textbook precision. Target 4, 1,000 meters. The fourth target sat at the edge of what most snipers would consider reliable range for the Barrett system. At this distance, bullet drop became significant, and the slightest error in wind reading could send a round wide. Maria took her time, feeling the subtle changes in air movement, calculating the ballistic trajectory in her head with the automatic precision of years of experience. The rifle bucked against her shoulder, and a full second later, the distant sound of impact confirmed another perfect hit. Morrison's expression was unreadable, but Maria caught the slight tightening around his eyes. Whatever he'd expected, it wasn't this level of performance. Target 5, 1,200 meters, this was getting serious. At 1,200 meters, they were pushing into the realm where only the most skilled marksman could guarantee consistent hits. The bullet would be in flight for nearly 2 seconds. Time enough for wind conditions to change, for the target to move if it were human, for a dozen variables to conspire against accuracy. Maria studied the target through her scope, noting the slight elevation difference, the way the heat haze distorted the image at maximum magnification. She'd made this shot before many times, but never with so much riding on the outcome. The trigger broke like glass, and the Barrett sent its massive projectile arcing through the thin mountain air. Time stretched like warm honey as everyone waited for the sound of impact. When it came, sharp and clear across the distance, a collective exhale rose from the watching crowd. Hit. Target 6, 400 meters. Now they were in the territory where luck began to matter as much as skill. At this range, the Barrett was reaching toward the edge of its effective envelope, and even tiny variations in ammunition or atmospheric conditions could affect accuracy. Maria could feel sweat beading on her forehead despite the cooling evening air. She took longer with this shot, reading and rereading the wind, checking and double-checking her calculations. The mathematics of long-range shooting became complex at this distance. Bullet drop, wind drift, the Coriolis effect of the Earth's rotation, even the decreasing air density at altitude. But Maria had internalized these calculations through thousands of hours of practice and hundreds of combat engagements. The sixth shot seemed to hang in the air forever. Before the distant clang confirmed another impossible hit, the crowd was no longer silent. A low murmur of appreciation and disbelief rippled through the assembled Marines and soldiers. Even hardened combat veterans were shaking their heads in amazement at the display of marksmanship they were witnessing. Morrison stood rigid, his jaw clenched tight. The trap he'd set was becoming his own humiliation, and everyone present could see it. Target 7, he said, his voice strained. 500 meters. The final target sat at the absolute limit of the Barrett's effective range, a tiny steel dot that was barely visible even through the high-powered scope. At this distance, the bullet would be in flight for nearly 3 seconds, subject to every variable the Afghan mountains could throw at it. Wind, elevation, temperature, humidity, all of it mattered at 1,500 meters. Maria settled behind the rifle for the last time, feeling the familiar weight of the stock against her shoulder, the smooth curve of the trigger under her finger. This shot would define everything that came after: her career, her reputation, her ability to serve the Marines who depended on her. But as she acquired the target through her scope, something unexpected happened. The pressure, the stakes, the watching crowd, all of it simply fell away. She was back on her grandfather's ranch, learning to read the wind in the cottonwood trees. She was in her first hide site in Iraq, protecting her squad with deadly precision. She was in the mountains of Afghanistan, holding an impossible position against overwhelming odds. She was exactly where she belonged. The final shot came naturally, inevitably like sunrise after a long night. The Barrett spoke its deadly language one last time, sending a 50 caliber message across 1,500 meters of hostile territory. For 3 eternal seconds the outcome hung in the balance. Then the distant ring of impact shattered the silence, and the range erupted in cheers. 7 targets, 7 perfect hits, at distances that would challenge Olympic shooters with the finest equipment available. Maria had delivered flawless performance under conditions that would have broken most marksmen. Morrison stood frozen for a long moment, staring downrange at the targets that had just witnessed his complete miscalculation. When he finally turned to face Maria, his expression was unreadable. "Pack up your gear, Staff Sergeant," he said quietly. The crowd fell silent, uncertainty replacing celebration. Had she won or lost? The Admiral's tone gave nothing away. "Sir?" Maria asked, confusion evident in her voice. Morrison stepped closer, close enough that only she could hear his next words. "Pack up your gear," he repeated, "because you're not going on tonight's mission." He paused, letting the words sink in. "You're coming with me to Bagram. There's a joint task force being formed for high-value target elimination. They need someone who can make impossible shots look routine." He raised his voice so the entire crowd could hear. "Ladies and gentlemen, you've just witnessed the finest display of marksmanship I've seen in 30 years of service. Staff Sergeant Castellanos will be receiving a commendation for excellence, and I'll be personally recommending her for advanced sniper instructor positions." The cheers that followed could probably be heard at the next firebase. Marines and soldiers rushed forward to congratulate Maria, their faces bright with pride and amazement. She'd not only defended her position, she'd elevated everyone around her in the process. But the most meaningful moment came later, as the crowd dispersed and equipment was being packed away. Admiral Morrison approached Maria one final time, his demeanor completely different from the confrontational figure who had entered her tent hours earlier. "Staff Sergeant," he said, extending his hand, "I owe you an apology. I came here with preconceptions that had no basis in reality. What you demonstrated today..." He shook his head. "I've never seen anything like it." Maria accepted the handshake, her grip firm and steady. "Sir, with respect, all I did was my job. The same job I've been doing for 3 tours. "No," Morrison said firmly. "What you did was extraordinary. And more importantly, you did it with honor and professionalism even when I was..." He paused, searching for words. "Even when I was being an ass." The admission drew a small smile from Maria. "Sir, I've dealt with worse." Morrison laughed, a genuine sound that transformed his entire face. "I bet you have. Tell me, Sergeant, what made you so confident you could make those shots?" Maria considered the question as she secured the Barrett in its case. "My grandfather told me something when I was learning to shoot, sir. He said the rifle knows when your heart is true. If you trust your training, trust your equipment, and trust yourself..." She closed the case with a decisive snap. "The shots make themselves." 6 months later, Maria would be operating with the most elite units in the military, her reputation preceding her into briefing rooms from Syria to Somalia. The 7 shots at Fob Shieldwall would become legend, told and retold in sniper schools and special operations training centers around the world. But the real victory wasn't in the shooting. It was in the moment when prejudice met competence and lost. It was in the Admiral who learned that excellence comes in all forms, and the Staff Sergeant who proved that sometimes the best response to doubt is simply perfect performance. Admiral Morrison kept his word. Maria's transfer to the Joint Task Force came through within a week, along with a commendation that highlighted not just her marksmanship, but her professionalism under pressure and her commitment to mission accomplishment above personal considerations. The night before she left Fob Shieldwall, Maria sat alone with her rifle one last time, cleaning and inspecting every component with the same meticulous care she'd shown that first day. The Barrett had served her faithfully through another test, another challenge overcome through preparation and skill. Tomorrow would bring new missions, new targets, new impossible shots that others would call routine when she made them. But tonight, in the quiet of her tent with her grandfather's lessons echoing in her memory, Staff Sergeant Maria Ghost Castellanos simply smiled and prepared for whatever came next. Because she knew, with the absolute certainty that only comes from perfect preparation meeting, perfect performance, that she was exactly where she belonged. And her rifle, her perfectly zeroed, battle-tested, legend-making Barrett M82A1, would be right there with her. 7 shots. 7 hits. 7 steps toward proving that excellence recognizes no boundaries except those we place on ourselves. The rifle knows when your heart is true, and Maria Castellanos had the truest heart of all.